Today we are going to finish up talking about late adulthood. So we will talk about emotional and social developments as we've talked about with every other section. And then we will end by talking about death and bereavement, which is grieving the loss of someone else. So I know this is kind of a heavy topic to end the class with, but it's important information to discuss. I think death is something that we tend to avoid talking about, particularly in our culture, and sometimes that can create issues. If it's not something you think about or talk about or plan ahead for, then that can sometimes make it a lot more difficult to cope with when it does come. So I know it's not the best topic in the world to end a class on, but I do think it is important. But we'll start by talking about emotional and social development. So just like with every other stage, we'll first start with Erikson's theory. It's the final stage or conflict that he proposed, is what he labeled ego integrity versus despair. The idea of ego integrity essentially is that you come to terms with the life that you have lived, and you also accept the fact that death is inevitable, and you find a way to sort of come to peace with that. People who experience ego integrity do so because they feel whole, they feel complete, they feel satisfied with the choices that they have made throughout their life and the achievements that they have gained. You're more likely to settle into ego integrity during this stage if you successfully mastered generativity during sort of earlier and middle adulthood. So that sort of passing on of your information to the next generation helps to come to this ego integrity. People who experience ego integrity tend to view life in the context of all of humanity. They see themselves as sort of a piece of this greater system. They accept that death is something that happens to all of us. It's the one thing that kind of unites everybody. And they also tend to believe that they will sort of live on through the next generation. So they have that connection with other humans. And ego integrity is associated with favorable psychological well-being during this stage. The opposite result that can happen is what's called despair. People who result in despair during this time often regret a lot of the decisions that they've made throughout their life. They may feel like they made a lot of wrong decisions and mistakes, and they also feel like the time that they have left is too short to kind of reconcile that, and so they have difficulty settling into ego integrity. They may be very bitter and angry and are typically going to be unaccepting of death, and that can be expressed as anger and contempt towards other people. One aspect that helps some elderly people reach that ego integrity is something called the positivity effect. The positivity effect refers to an enhanced memory of emotionally positive information compared to emotionally negative information. And most older people tend to show this positivity effect compared to younger people. So the older you get, the more positive things you remember and the less negative things you remember. And it's been measured in a huge number of ways. You can simply ask elderly people to just report some of the stories from their life, and they'll typically report more positive stories. You can do this sort of probing method where you just give them random words and ask them to recall either stories or events that are related to that word, and again you get more positive events. There's also more sort of experimental approaches where they'll present elderly people and younger people with some positive images and some negative images. So positive images would be maybe like flowers, things that are really happy and positive. Negative images may have like sad things in them basically, and then they later test their memory over those images, and elderly people tend to remember more of the positive images compared to the negative images, and younger adults don't show quite that difference. It's been shown that having that positivity effect can contribute to resilience, and it leads to constructive strategies that help with interpersonal conflicts, avoiding interpersonal conflicts. So if you have more positive memories of your family members, things like that, then you're less likely to pick fights or hold grudges. So all of that can help contribute to sort of a better coping with this end-of-life period. Older people tend to have greater competence at emotional self-regulation. That may be one of the aspects that contributes to the positivity effect. So they may be more capable of using problem-centered coping, where they, instead of focusing on the feelings, they sort of address what the problem is and come up with solutions. They are also more effective at using emotion-based coping, where they, especially if there's something that's outside of their control, they don't really have a way to come up with a solution. They're good at kind of looking at the positives and finding those positives, and so then it makes sense that they would remember more positive things if they tend to view things more positively to begin with. In addition to that, they have this shortened time perspective, so they often are very aware of the fact that they don't have very much time left, and so because of that, they really have a desire to focus on meaningful and positive experiences and kind of, get the best that they can out of the years that they have left. And so high levels of emotional stability during this period are the norm. It's kind of exceptional or not normal if someone has sort of emotional instability during this period. This period of late adulthood has been kind of expanding as our life expectancy increases, as we have advances in medications and sanitation and better lifestyles and things. And sometimes this period is referred to as the third age. The idea of the third age is kind of just a different way of classifying these age groups compared to the way that I've been doing it throughout the semester. So the idea is that the first age is kind of childhood and adolescence. The second age is young adulthood, when you're kind of learning your skills and your career, and then third age is basically retirement age, where you switch to this more sort of personal fulfillment stage, where the goals are self-realization and high life satisfaction. And like I said, this third age has been prolonged because of the advancements that we've had here recently. People in this third age, so typically 65 to 79 is about the age I'm talking about here, contribute billions in volunteer work. So it used to be the case, decades ago, that whenever someone retired, it was kind of this single event. It's like one day you're working, the next day you're retired, you go home, you spend all your time at home, or sort of in this vacation state. Retirement now has become much more blurry. It's more likely that people will continue their job, maybe in a part-time capacity. They may quit for a period of time but then go back to work. And also most people who retire, instead of just kind of traveling and doing leisure activities, they tend to contribute a lot to volunteer workforces. They may continue to participate in the workforce, as I talked about. They often give a lot of their time to their families, helping with childcare, things like that. And like I said, they spend a huge amount of time doing volunteer work during this period. So much so that some people have suggested that there really needs to be more volunteer and service opportunities made available, because oftentimes there's more elderly people available and willing to work than there are service opportunities that they can engage in. One of the kind of logistical challenges during this time is trying to settle on housing arrangements. So as people start to have physical and mental declines, they may have difficulty dressing themselves, feeding themselves, transportation, all those kinds of aspects. Then they have to start figuring out, do I want to keep trying to live in my own home independently, or do I need to adjust to some other sort of living situation? And so these are kind of broad categories of housing arrangements that you find for people over age 65 in general. Most elderly people, probably not surprisingly, prefer to stay in their own home and sort of age in place is the way that it's phrased. And for the most part, as long as someone doesn't have a really severe physical or mental impairment or disability, then the majority of elderly adults in that situation do live in their own home, either by themselves or with their spouse if they still have a spouse. Obviously, living in your own home gives you the greatest personal control. You have total control over your schedule, over your social interactions, your diet, all those aspects. A lot of people may choose to live with family members, so either they have their adult children come live with them, or they go move in with their adult children to make it easier for caregiving. That's more common in certain cultures. I think we kind of talked about this last time, but so for example, like African American, Asian, Hispanic, and Native American families all are more likely to live in sort of an extended family rather than just the nuclear family, so they often will have grandparents living with them, for example. But the number of people living alone during this stage is increasing in pretty much all cultures, particularly Asian American cultures. So it used to be that the large majority of Asian American elderly people lived with the family, but now about 65% of them choose to live on their own instead. The number of people living alone is higher for women, and that's partially because women have a longer lifespan, like we talked about last time, and so they're more likely to have had a spouse pass away, and so they're more likely to be living, completely on their own than males are. In addition to just living sort of in your own home, the sort of next step from that, I guess, would be what's called residential communities. And there's a huge variation in these. It's not like there's one type. It's not something that's really like federally regulated, so there's a large amount of variability in sort of the type, style, quality of these residential communities. But about 12% of older adults live in these residential communities, at least in the US. So some of these consist of just like townhomes or apartments that look essentially just like any other townhome or apartment, but on the inside they've been modified slightly to accommodate older adults. So they may have, you know, like handles and things in the showers so that older adults can help themselves if they're falling. They may have like the seat that carries you up the stairs so you don't have to walk upstairs. Just some of those logistical accommodations that help make life easier. And some of them also have these sort of life care communities. So there may be a bunch of townhomes or apartments all together, and then somewhere situated in the middle of that, there may be a more sort of family-style dwelling where they can get together for activities. And most of them also offer some sort of services. So they may have like meal services where someone can come and cook meals for you. They have housekeeping, laundry, just all kinds of services available to help accommodate any issues that someone might be having. I don't know how familiar you guys are with things in Dubuque, but so for example in Dubuque there's Applewood Apartments, which is kind of this residential community style. Eagle Point Place, where some of you may have gone to interview elderly people, would be considered something like a residential communities. Most of the people there have their own individual little apartment that they live in, but then they have all these amenities and services offered to them. And then by far the most restrictive living arrangement for elderly people would be nursing homes. There's less variability in nursing homes than there is in residential communities, but there is still some variability as far as quality goes. Nursing homes greatly restrict the autonomy of the people living there. So most elderly people in a nursing home are going to have their schedules sort of dictated by the caregivers. Their diets are, you know, they're not going to have much control over that. They will have some social interaction with the other residents in the facilities, but they have very limited choices in a lot of cases for that. So they may not be able to choose who they're socializing with, or what time of day they're socializing, or what activities they're engaging in. They're just kind of, you know, put out into a room with other residents and told to do whatever activity they have planned for that day. So there's a lot less autonomy in nursing homes compared to some of the other choices. And there's a whole slew of issues with nursing homes too that we could discuss, but that would probably take an entire lecture itself. I think we all kind of maybe have a stereotypical view of elderly people living in nursing homes, but in reality only about 3% of people over the age of 65 in the US at least live in nursing homes. So it's one of the least common housing arrangements for elderly people. And typically someone's only going to end up in a nursing home if they have really severe physical or mental impairments to where, or maybe they don't have family members available that can care for them. And so that's the most common reason that they would end up in a nursing home. There are movements to try and develop more sort of better nursing home models that allow for more autonomy, that allow the person to continue to live a more independent lifestyle. Some of these are referred to as the greenhouse model, which is kind of more similar to a residential community. A lot of these greenhouse models have sort of individual houses. You may have, you know, 10 or so residents living within a house. They're usually large houses with the sort of individual rooms in them. And then there's kind of a central area where the care people can take the residents for meals and activities and things. And they also usually allow more autonomy. They allow the residents to sort of pick out their schedule, pick out the activities that they want to do. So it's kind of like in between a nursing home and a residential community.